And of course, let's keep talking
It's
about
getting
shaders
better and
because
better
you
with
might be
each
able to
iteration.
notice one
Before
small
I
detail
tell
in the
next
game
right now,
I should add a
there's no
small
resolution
resolution.
bugging out.
Game development is fun. In fact, creative endeavors are generally pretty enjoyable, at least in my opinion. And well, I guess that's why I'm here. Not only to show off an itty bitty game that I've had the pleasure of making, but to make a video about the development process. This is it. Both the free to play game and the video about it. So stick around because I want you to. Backstories are fun, right? Here's a little bit of mine, and I'll try not to bore you too much. I grew up enjoying video games, which may be obvious enough, and of course, the thought of making my own game occasionally flowed through my brain. However, nothing serious ever came out of those moments, as I thought programming was reserved for geniuses. So I grew older and went to college. Near the end of my first semester, I started seriously asking the question, could I make a video game? I'd recently learned that Eric Barone made one of my all-time favorite video games all by himself, and I had a decent amount of free time, so I looked into the possibility. Long story made short, I learned a little Python, took a Godot tutorial, completed a game jam, and then it all went dark. Just kidding. I spent the next few semesters doing school and a little bit of game development on the side. All the while, I dreamed of someday making a career out of game dev. But fear and laziness got the better of me most of the time. I've had a few bursts of motivation which drove me to making a few small games and a bad YouTube video. But now I'm here, and I feel at this moment is a little bit more definitive. And with that, I present to you just another small game project. But it's the first of many before I decide to make something more significant. See, I wanted to try and make something really simple and gradually make it better with game design tricks, as something of a learning challenge for myself. So, here was the initial game idea. Yup, that's just it. No game design document or anything to strengthen the concept other than some natural ideas floating around in my brain. So, I opened my lovely game engine of choice, and beautiful. We are off to a great start. Of course, there's no goal making the game feel pointless. So naturally, I made one. Too easy. Maybe some obstacles for the sake of challenge. And hey, a little variation makes it even better. Now I know what you're thinking, because what is a game without it? Players need to take some level of control over what happens in the game, which makes it something that should never go unconsidered. Input, control, agency. Let's just call it agency because I think that sounds more profound. As you can see, the game can now be played by a person. I've also changed the positions and quantity of the peg obstacles to accommodate for the increased amount of possible drop locations. The bounciness is just an added touch. But still, I'm bored. This game isn't very stimulating, which is where the juice comes in. Yep. Just another word for feedback as it concerns me, which is all about telling the player what has happened and making them feel something about it. Here's how that looks and sounds. I've used both visual and auditory stimulus to communicate that the ball has bounced on a peg. Now, given the nature of human perception and the constraints of gaming technology, visual and auditory stimulus are almost always the primary focus of feedback. But some games stimulate touch through the vibration of the controller, and Nintendo even stimulated taste with their bitter game cartridges. If you know. Moving on. This looks pretty familiar now, doesn't it? If not, it will once you've played for just a few seconds. It never changes, and thus becomes less interesting over time. In games, there are a few ways to solve the issue of repetition. One is to make an abundance of unique content. That takes a bit of work and is best when you're trying to deliver a dedicated experience. Another way is to add randomness. This generally takes a lot of work as well, but it's very scalable. The problem is that it removes a lot of the control from the designer. But hey, I don't care too much about that, so here is the same game with a little bit of randomness. Now the gameplay is quite a bit funner. More fun, that is. The random shifting of pegs and the random placement of bars changes the scene, forcing the player to adapt, and thus engage with the game more. And if you haven't noticed, I've also added an example of how these game design elements can overlap. The bouncing sounds of the pegs shift to a random pitch, randomized feedback. Absolute genius. And for a little getting stuck insurance, I've given the circle a timer indicated by size. When it shrinks too much, you respawn. It's getting better and better with each iteration, and I think for the next one, I should add a simple sense of progression. Because the goal is easy to achieve, a score counter might be best. Now there's an even larger goal to be progressed towards. Each time you achieve the small goal of reaching the bottom, you get an upward counting score determined by how much space you traveled each drop. That's nice, but what's the point of the points? That was the question I asked myself before I added a cost to dropping the circle. Now, there's a reason to try and get as many points as possible. I also added another means of getting points that makes the player adapt even more to the randomly changing board. The changes I made after this were very significant. Maybe what I should have done was add upgrades that you can unlock with points, but instead, I decided to invest into another game design element that drastically changed the feel of the game. Let me show you. Wow. Before, I was making very small iterative steps. Now, I've basically replaced everything I did before in an attempt to make it follow a theme. It's not a big deal in this case because everything I'd added before was pretty simple and quick. I didn't lose much time, but there's definitely something to be learned here. Clearly, it's beneficial to have a concept of the approximate whole experience before you invest time into making it. The funny thing is that the point of the project was to lack a concept before development, to see where the wind takes me. But when it came time to add the game element of illusion, or in other words, fantasy, I chose one that required me to remove most of what I'd done before, because they weren't fitting with the theme. My bad. Let's just call it subtractive game design and pretend I never messed up. Now let's take a look at what I added. New obstacles, a bigger map, a new form of player agency, which is just a boost, better visuals, and most importantly, plenty of room for improvement. As you can see, the obstacles are more interactive now, responding physically to your collisions, which provides some level of feedback, but also adds a little bit of depth to the gameplay. It makes the board feel dynamic, which it is. With the visuals, I was experimenting with Godot's built-in visual noise generator, because I find it fun and interesting to create textures using noise. Instead of drawing the sprites in some art software, I made most of the object's shapes with polygons within the engine. I then applied the noise texture to them, and voila, I've got my sprite. For the brick background and foreground, I made the shapes in Inkscape, and used those to mask their noise textures. Then I just applied a parallax effect to them to give a greater sense of depth. Neat tricks, but I don't recommend them because I believe the overuse of polygons and especially noise textures was costly for performance, making loading times take much longer, and beyond just that, these tricks were even a bigger hassle when I added shaders, which I'll talk about later. But for now, let's take another big leap forward and take a look at the new elements. Particle effects as a form of feedback, new forms of agency such as subtle airborne movement control and directional bouncing impulse when inputs are timed correctly, ghosts that revolve around the circle before exploding, sending the player flying in the opposite direction, acting as an opposition to the increased player control. A death barrier below the circle that forces the player to try and stay up for longer, making the obstacles helpful instead of hurtful. So they're more like props now than obstacles. And speaking of, bouncing on the props, too much makes them dissolve until you respawn, forcing the player to keep moving. The dissolve effect was created using shaders, but it didn't work very well with the way I'd made my sprites. If we take a closer look at the candle, for instance, you'll see that it's made up of a few distinct visual parts. Each one needs to use the same effect, but because they're different sizes and shapes, the effect looks different on every piece in an ugly way. I do fix this later, but I would have avoided the problem outright if I'd simply made sprites instead of the whole noise polygon thing. Next set of things I added include the following: collectible coins that force the player to be more creative with their movements, an indicator for how many hits a propsicle has before dissolving, and of course, let's keep talking about shaders, because you might be able to notice one small detail in the game right now. No, your resolution isn't bugging out. I've applied a pixelation shader to the entire screen. Pretty neat. I really like the charm of it, but it's also a clever visual trick because it essentially covers many visual flaws and allows the player to use their imagination to fill in the gaps. What flaws, you may ask? Well, let's take a look at the next set of changes I made. Despite my art being absolutely gorgeous, my outline shader didn't work flawlessly, as you can see, or can't see because the pixels cover it up. And speaking of the outline, implementing this required a few things. I had to use sub-viewports to combine the visual parts of the props and apply that combination to the sprite displayed for the prop. I then apply the shader to that single sprite, and it works flawlessly, other than, of course, making performance even worse. But this also fixed the dissolve issue from before. I'd call it a win. I also used this sub-viewport trick to make the circle clear like a crystal ball, while still having an animated noise texture and shaders. So yeah, the outlines look good, and I added a couple other little visual effects like the ghosts dancing. They look so cute now. Too bad they explode. Anyways, I also added a couple new props for more variation. All that's left now are the sound effects and music, which I went ahead and added. No use for talking about them as they can speak for themselves, given that this is the final product. Why don't you take a look and listen? Well, that's it for you. There are definitely a few directions I could take this project if I wanted to continue it into the future, but I probably won't. I've got other game ideas I'd like to visit instead. The game is free on itch.io, and I've got a link in the description if you'd like to play it. And if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. And if you want to see more content like this, I think you know what I'm getting at. Criticism and feedback would also be greatly appreciated. So, thank you. Yep. This is basically the end of the video. You can leave if you'd like, but if you're sticking around, got something on my mind. The game that inspired me to use the pixelation shader was none other than A Short Hike, one of my favorite games in the world. I especially love the music, which is the subject of this discussion. Occasionally, while I'm cooking, I'll either listen to that soundtrack or the Mabe Village theme from the new Link's Awakening on loop. And I'm wondering, if any, what video game music do you find yourself listening to regularly? And in what situations? Leave your response in the comments section, if you please. I'm genuinely curious, and between you and me, I hear it helps with the YouTube algorithm. So, again, thank you.